Hello and welcome to LUC's podcast. My name's Kim Chamberlain and I'm a GIS consultant here at LUC. Today we are going to be catching up on what happened at the Place Northwest Greater Manchester Development Update, which took place on the 10th of September. We have Melissa Kurihara and Lucy Wallwork, who are both planners here at LUC, to chat about their experience at the event. So you both did a joint presentation, and that was titled Constraint or Opportunity, What Next for Manchester's Greenbelt? What were the key points you wanted to get across about the Greenbelt by doing that presentation?
I think it was just a really good way for us to showcase a little bit about what we do as a company, but also something that's been really relevant for Manchester over the last kind of 4 or 5 years, particularly with GMSF moving through its various stages, and a piece of work that we've been involved in as part of that. So that's the Greater Manchester Greenbelt Assessment. And it has been, and we said in the presentation, such a controversial part of GMSF, but also such a vital one. It's been hugely important for Manchester to think about how it's going to deliver the ambitious growth that it's got over the next kind of 20 years. And however you look at it, that is very likely to involve some changes to the Greenbelt. So I think we were just kind of giving everybody a bit of an overview of what greenbelts are and why they exist and how they've come about, but then also bringing that forward through into how that might change as part of GMSF. And I think I touched on the kind of the nitty gritty of where greenbelts come from and what's been going on in Manchester, and Lucy touched on some of our kind of future thinking. So I'll let her say a little bit more about kind of where she went off in the presentation.
Yeah, I mean, we sort of did a two-part look at the Greenbelt in a way, didn't we? But I think what was interesting was we heard some really fascinating stuff from the other speakers, a few people from what are often called the M60 towns, talking about town centre regeneration and exciting stuff that's going on, whether it's Stockport or Rochdale, these kind of places. So there's an interesting conversation going on around that. And I think it's just really interesting to bring the Greenbelt into that discussion, because these are not separate things, they're quite symbiotic, right? So there's a really great opportunity in Greater Manchester on the back potentially of like the COVID lockdown and the experience of 2020, of people maybe being able to move back into those towns and help revive them. But essentially what the point I was making in part was that those people, particularly this year, what they do at the weekend is they want to get out into the countryside, right? So enabling like the Greenbelt to kind of perform really well as a resource in that way, both for biodiversity and also for recreation. There's this huge new desire to have accessible green space on your doorstep, which there always was, but it's really come to the fore, hasn't it, as we've kind of experienced lockdown this year, and it's really changing people's expectations of where they live. And I think the Greenbelt has a really important role to play, particularly we showed a map of the Greenbelt, didn't we, Melissa, in our presentation on one of our slides, and it's not a belt. It's like I can't think of a good alternative description of what it is, but it's like kind of a frilly skirt or something.
I don't know. Like a doily, yeah.
Like a doily, yeah. It's like a doily. There we go. It needs rebranding, because it reaches right into these urban areas with little sort of green fingers. It's not just a big belt constraining growth around the outside. So there's lots of potential to make sure it's used to its best potential. Really,
that's the word I would use. It's full potential, because there are bits that are performing really, really well, but there are also bits that could perform so much better than they are doing. And I think it's just about recognizing what that is and how that might be brought about.
Yeah, and understanding what the Greenbelt is, right? Like I'm sure a lot of the people in that room are planners and developers and exactly what it is, but it's about open. The Greenbelt distinction is in the MPPF about openness, but with this great pressure on space and the need for green space and also kind of space for nature as well, I think it's time for a new way of looking at it, really.
So whilst we're talking about reforms, how would that tie in with the new planning white paper, Planning for the Future? There was a lot of talk about these reforms in the panel discussion you were a part of, Melissa, and quite a bit of speculation about what changes are likely to occur as a result. What impact do you see them having on the Greenbelt and housing delivery, not just in Greater Manchester, but elsewhere?
Well, I think that is one of the key bits of the reforms, which there has been very, very little reform. In terms of the Greenbelt, the white paper doesn't really suggest any changes in terms of how the government will be treating the Greenbelt. It's very clear throughout it. I mean, there's several references that the Greenbelt designation will stay. and that the greenbelt designation will stay pretty much in its current form, as in that you would need to have exceptional circumstances to bring about changes within that land or changes to the boundaries of the greenbelt. So I think, depending on your view of it, that's a bit of a missed opportunity, really, in terms of whether there could be the chance to allow the greenbelt to be used in different ways, as Lucy was just saying, in terms of trying to increase its functionality. Personally, I do think it's a little bit of a missed opportunity. They've brought in such wide-ranging proposals for reform of the system. I think it's a bit odd that they've just left this completely alone. I mean, I think it's very much down to politics and public opinion as to what the greenbelt is, and I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding with the general public as to actually what greenbelt is, but it's obviously just too much of a bit of a hot potato for them to want to really try and bring about any form of real change in that area.
Yeah, I think they just didn't want to touch it, did they? So you've got these zones, and there's references to protected zones, which essentially the greenbelt would lie underneath, but it was notably skirted in the reforms. I think that's definitely clear.
Part of the reforms which do kind of are impacted by the greenbelt, I should say, it's not really to do with the greenbelt, are in terms of the housing methodology. So the current approach to setting housing targets is very much just a formulaic approach that looks at need and affordability and sets a cap. So it's quite a simple kind of, we look at these data bits that go into it and then we set a figure, and then it's for each local authority to start looking at whether that can be delivered, looking at potential constraints in their area. And the proposals in the white paper almost take that second stage away from local authorities and say they're going to put it in as part of setting the target for that area. So any form of potential constraints, whether that's the greenbelt or flood risk or kind of designations for environmental and heritage value, is going to be factored in by the government when they're setting that target for each local authority area. I think that could bring about some quite significant changes for some local authorities in terms of the target that they're set to work with. Bringing it back specifically to greenbelt, I think there's a risk that some of those greenbelt authorities could see really big reductions in their housing targets because there is too much constraint for them. But the counter to that is that those figures are going to have to be put elsewhere, and the chance is that they could be passed to other more rural authorities outside of the greenbelt who end up having much higher targets because they're not constrained in the same way by greenbelt designation. And I think that has a real risk of almost leapfrogging the greenbelt and having quite high growth areas in slightly more rural locations away from our major urban areas. And I think that's something which will need to be looked at when it does come out. And I think there perhaps needs a little bit more thought around actually using the greenbelt, which is a policy designation rather than a physical restriction when setting housing targets.
Yeah, particularly when thinking about sustainable transport patterns and what have you, depending on what sort of transport patterns we settle into after COVID, but it's gonna be a big part of that, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Lucy, you mentioned in the presentation about how we need to be led by different types of maps, so not just the transport and the road network maps, but also to consider green infrastructure networks, river valleys, the nature recovery network and so on. Can you talk to us a bit more about the link you're trying to draw between the greenbelt and green infrastructure?
Yeah, absolutely. I've touched on it a little bit earlier, haven't I? But it's about the kind of maps that we look at that guide development. And I guess I was making a broader point. Often as part of these discussions, traditionally, certainly until very recently, there was very little mention of green infrastructure. It was often sort of tagged on, some trees at the end of a design proposal for a certain area, a bit of landscaping, but it wasn't thought of right at the beginning of the development process of where do we put our development, how do we integrate it into what's there, what's the infrastructural basis. So we'd often look at like strategic road networks in terms of access or all kinds of other figures. But I think the point I was making is I brought up a map of actually the ecosystem service mapping that Greater Manchester has done. This one particular was of the Irwell Valley sort of catchment area, and just starting to have a think about whether the development community is particularly literate in these kind of maps as they might be in other kind of infrastructural maps when they're looking at how a city develops. and really saying that I think the mapping is there now and the data is there now. You'll know as a GIS consultant, Kim, but particularly in Greater Manchester, there's been some really pioneering work done on ecosystem service mapping, on natural capital. There's a natural capital investment plan. And I think we really need to start looking at this really at an early stage of development that helps guide things through rather than sort of tagging it on at the end, which was a point I was making about map literacy, which I say will be close to your heart, Kim, as GIS, as part of the GIS team. Yeah, and just thinking about that in a very, very different way. The other point I was making was about the reason that I think people have to start thinking in this way is if you look at the direction of travel in national policy, we've got really big landmark bills coming up that are going to really hopefully force our hands a bit in doing this in a meaningful way. So you've got the Environment Bill, which has been much delayed by everything that's gone on, but it's when that passes through Parliament that will bring in, for example, the need for biodiversity net gain requirements on new development sites. So that's about providing more habitat on the finished development than you had when you started with, which our ecologists at LUC are working on quite a lot. That might be on site. It might also be off site at certain strategic parts of the green infrastructure network, for example. But it also means, I think, from a developer point of view, really thinking about, for instance, when new development's being master planned, thinking about landscape-led master planning, again, thinking about GI-led master planning. So at LUC, we've got a lot of landscape planners, a lot of landscape architects, and it's the first thing you look at is the landscape setting. It's not about how many units you want, which roads you want. It's about seeing how it sits within that wider landscape and its biodiversity function, the recreation function, and all those GI functions that we talk about in the GI jargon. I think that, again, it's flipping things around. So that is the start of the conversation rather than the end of the conversation. I think is going to be really important.
Talking about the wider landscape and thinking differently about it, there's recently been talk in the media and calls for wild belt land to be part of England's planning strategy. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, that was a really interesting call to see. I think it came, I believe, from the Wildlife Trust, slightly in response, I think, to the proposed planning reforms. And I think it's fair to say that in some quarters, there are some concerns about the reforms and what they'll do for the environment and whether they set a strong enough basis for the nature recovery network that we're talking about. So I think this is what the Wildlife Trust were talking about, essentially requiring that the new zoning system as part of the planning reforms took greater account of the need to essentially have nature recovery areas, and they term that as wild belts. And I think that's just quite an interesting way of reframing some of how we think about the green belt. This is not framing it just as openness, but really about framing it as a way to start hitting, for instance, the biodiversity targets that we've been missing. So, I'm not saying that's something that the government's necessarily going to act upon in their proposals, but I think it's a really important point to make and aligns with a lot of the things that we've been talking about today, and a nice kind of new way of thinking about it as a wild belt rather than a green belt. It's interesting, I think.
I agree. It makes it sound like it's got more of a purpose than just being a green belt.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so before we wrap up, one question for both of you, if you can answer in just a couple of words each. What is next for Greater Manchester? I'll come to you first, Melissa.
Well, that's a very big question, but I think from me, in terms of being a planner and following GMSF quite closely, it'll be really interesting to see what happens over the next few weeks with that. So they're currently looking for approval from all of the elected representatives for the 10 GM local authorities, and if that passes through, there'll be another round of consultation happening later in the year, so probably early November time. So slightly delayed from when it was planned, partly to do with COVID, but everything seems to still be moving ahead. So it will be interesting to see that moving forward and hopefully going into government next year and trying to get that through and over the line, because I think that'd be a massive achievement for the region if we did manage to get that through.
Yeah, still through such uncertain times, to still get it through would be good, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
How about you, Lucy? What next for Greater Manchester?
Well, yeah, it like Melissa says, it is a big question. I think how I see it is I think there's scope for really interesting things to happen in those outlying towns around Greater Manchester. So getting away from that focus on pure city centre, high-rise towers, you know, all the regeneration that's been going on in Manchester city centre, which is interesting itself. But I think those towns on the outskirts of Greater Manchester, so we're talking about Bolton, Wigan, Rochdale, Stockport, I think there's really exciting stuff going on there, and I think they're going to be a big focus of where we go, particularly as part of that kind of levelling up agenda and focus on towns on the national agenda. But I think, like I say, banging my GI drum again, I think we've got to make sure that green infrastructure is really the basis of those, and we're hearing some of the right things said. So if we look at the kind of Stockport Town West master plan that was talked about by one of the speakers at Place Northwest, actually, it's all about looking at the River Mersey Valley, like turning towards the River Mersey Valley, having really sustainable villages, having play streets rather than just big roads going through. They're saying all the right things. I think that needs to be delivered on the ground, and really picking up on some of the really innovative stuff that Greater Manchester and the GMCA has been doing, along with people like City of Trees. You know, all the data's there and all the push is there. It just needs to really follow through into the development, and then I think we could be looking at something really interesting.
Oh, you make me feel so hopeful and inspired.
Especially with so many people mentioning sort of in the panel discussions about how they're obviously the people in their areas, there is the demand for it, or the people are asking for greener solutions, for that green infrastructure to be there. Hopefully, yeah, it will be delivered.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks both for joining and for sharing your thoughts. Look forward to the next one, and thanks for listening.